All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all for joining us for the workshop on entrepreneurial finance and innovation, our first of this academic year. And we are delighted to have Jill Brennan from Duke here to talk to us about artificial intelligence and high-skilled work. This is joint with Roni Michaely. The format will be as it has in the past, 40 minutes for our presenter, followed by a 15-minute discussion from our discussant, and 10 minutes for Q&A. So Jill, if you want to share your slides, I think we can get started.
Great, thank you. I'm excited to be here, and it looks like a very exciting program that you put together. So let me see, there we go. Okay,
Yep.
Perfect.
And just as a reminder for our participants, the Q&A is open, so feel free to post your questions there, and we will appropriately interrupt Jill to get them answered.
Okay, cool. So great. This paper is Artificial Intelligence and High-Skilled Work. It's one of the first times I'm presenting it, so I'm excited about that. It is fun for me because this paper is really sort of blends some of the research that I like. I'm really curious about innovation and technology, but I've also had a strong, belief in the importance of social skills in work and in the importance of culture, and sort of this paper is exciting because it blends it. But before I get into that, I want to just talk about why it's a big deal. And it's a big deal because a lot of people think that AI is the most important general purpose technology of our era. It's going to change how we do things in many areas, so personalized medicine, enhanced security, improved transportation. There's a lot of different areas where we can see it being disruptive and leading to big growth. And so what is it? Well, it's a powerful form of automation that improves prediction and helps machines to act more like humans. There's many applications, and as I said, it's probably one of the most important general purpose technologies of our era. In 2019, just to put the numbers in perspective, as we're all finance people, investments exceeded 70 billion globally, and in startups in particular, there's 40 billion in investment. So it's actually more concentrated in startups than it is elsewhere. Advances in AI, though, they raise questions for governments, and in particular about what the future of work will look like and if any policy interventions are needed. So there's a rich literature on other technologies. You can look at the automation, you can go back to looking at electricity or even steam engine as other previous general purpose technologies. What I think many would argue is different this time is that it's going to be the effect on high-skilled workers. So, previous generations may have had some job displacement, but there was this idea that you could upskill or you could do something. And whereas now the notion is that it's actually really going to affect these high-skilled workers. And so what we're going to look at ultimately is a nuance, but the other nuance I want to concentrate on too is that a fact for AI adoption is that it doesn't really rely on internal investments, whereas a lot of previous technologies was the incumbent firms making the investment. And so these models were really like first mover advantage type of models, whereas now, it's a lot being driven by external startups. All right, so with 80% of the data in the world created in the last 2 years, what we think is judgment matters more than ever. Technology is a complement to sound judgment and knowledge, not a substitute. So this is a quote from Joyce Cheng. She's the head of global research at JP Morgan, and it's sort of this notion that there's complements and substitutes is exactly what we want to go after in our research. Given that AI and big data enhance prediction, what are the implications for incumbent workers traditionally tasked with prediction tasks or work? Well, we're going to sort of focus on it in this stock analyst context. You might be like, that's not really, what my first jump off point for AI would have been, but it's actually great because it has several advantages. So first, well-defined. So it's a prediction problem. We're forecasting stock prices, we're forecasting earnings. That's something that, is very well defined. It's also, there's very detailed data. There's been detailed data since before AI was adopted, so we can also understand sort of these changes over time. But it's also a task that requires both hard and soft skills. If you talk to any analyst, they're like, can you please add color to your analysis here? They love to say different things on conference calls. They love to look into the whites of managers' eyes and know if they're telling the truth. And this is an important social component that can't be taken away. But also, what I think is important for, sort of standard academic research, there's important variation in AI intensity, and we're going to talk about that more. What we really think about it is at the stock level, what AI is now it's sort of, we're taking every piece of information we can get and we're trying to analyze it into a rating or a buy sell or something like that. And there's some stocks that just disproportionately get attention. Tesla gets way more attention than it could possibly need in the world. But because of this, we might be getting sort of more crowd wisdom or more knowledge about that stock. And so this variation across industry, Tesla versus Ford, we're going to sort of use that to help with our identification. But let me get more into that. So what are firms doing these days? Given the sort of many people in here know about fintech, but a lot of fintech is sort of streamlining and synthesizing many data sources relevant for investment recommendations. So this is sort of the papers that were originally looking at satellite images, but there's all the Twitter and sentiment stuff. There's also weather patterns. There's looking at cars and parking lots. There's even what's going on online right now. And so people are trying to understand what your next move is and then aggregate that to sales, aggregate that to other factors, okay? Testable hypotheses. So what do we have? Well, we have the sort of canonical task-based framework. So this is a lot of David Otter's work, and we're going to use that and build off of it for our hypothesis. And in this framework, the idea is, a job is really a set of tasks. And the tasks that we have, can be grouped into different components. And so one thing is that maybe AI is going to be a big substitute. That is, people are going to switch careers, or analysts are going to depart, or they're going to change coverage. They're going to move away from those high AI stocks because AI already figured it out for them, and they're going to do it sort of the low AI stocks, the stocks that people don't pay attention to on social media. Or there's this idea of complementary tasks. Actually, AI is going to be great. It's going to be just like previous technologies. It's going to free up our time. We don't have to run the Excel models anymore. We can do other stuff. We can focus on our sort of soft skill advantage. So that's going to be, our social skills. That's going to be gathering information. It's going to be those things that, can't necessarily be automated. And then finally, we're going to sort of talk about big picture implications at the end. So things like product quality, but also compensation for analysts. So we're going to look at if overall consensus forecast changes, individual effort changes, and sort of how we see that ultimately playing into the analyst compensation. So to give you a preview of our findings, we find, yes, analysts are substitutes, especially high-skilled ones. So I think it was one of those findings that sort of surprised me. I didn't think it would come out so much in these high-skilled workers, but you just see it that really the top quality ones are the ones leaving, whether they recognize it early and we're moving to a different equilibrium is a totally different question. But it is the really talented guys and they're leaving. But also in this substitutes, we also see it in just choices of stock coverage. So we see that the high AI stocks, people are shifting their coverage sort of towards lower AI stocks. Complementary tasks. So we see that there is this more nuanced hypothesis consistent with sort of some of the prior, GPTs that brought about changes, that we see analysts now are shifting to soft skills. That is, they increase their meetings with management and institutional investors. And they also change the type of questions that they ask on earnings calls. So I see a shift from sort of asking questions about, I would say, easy to observe or AI observable metrics like sales and stuff like that, more towards these harder to understand metrics. So things like brand or engagement or culture, any of that stuff. Okay. We then also see evidence of product quality. That is, analysts improve their forecast on average. the consensus forecast also improves. So this suggests, even with these high analyst departures, we're still everybody's efforts going in there. So the product is actually coming out better.
Jill, can I interrupt you for just 1 second? There was a clarifying question, which I think a number of people had, which is, can you define what you mean by low versus high AI stocks for those who may have either jumped in a minute late or kind of missed that definition?
Sure. So we're using, so I'm going to get into the platform in a little bit that we use, but we use a fintech platform that has a bunch of different data sets that they've gathered, sort of alternative data. We use their social media data, which is primarily, sort of bloggers, Twitter type of data. And we take stocks, and if you're in the top 25% of social media, then you are being, that's what we consider high AI intensity. We do a lot of robustness around this, so it's not driven by that, but it's sort of, think of it as lots of people talking about this stock on social media, some of which could create, crowd wisdom. Okay, great. And so, did I have another question? Sorry, I saw a pop-up of questions. If we want to just go with questions, that's fine too. Steve, what was your question? Oh, so where do these analysts go to? That is also in our thing. They go to non-research jobs disproportionately. We find that they're going to sort of investor relations roles as opposed to in the past where they might have went to sort of buy-side research roles or roles with, say, an asset manager or something like that. And then finally for the compensation, because that is the last of our preview of our main findings, and then I will sort of get into these nuanced details that you guys are very excited about, so I appreciate the enthusiasm, which is compensation. And so, it is very impossible to get compensation data, but we do know that the analyst contracts for their jobs are set on sort of, how much trade volume they bring in and sort of the abnormal stuff that they can direct towards their firm because of their recommendations. And what we find is when analysts make buy-sell recommendations that they're actually getting, and this is within analyst stock pairs, so it's actually a close match over time, we see that there's less reaction to them, both in volume and in terms of movement in share prices. And so that's typically going to be associated with decreased compensation. And I know that this goes a little bit towards some of the bigger picture questions about inequality and stuff like that. And so it would suggest we might have a compression of the wage schedule. Yeah, if somebody types, I'm actually, because of that's how I have my students do it, if you want to type questions into chat, that is my best way to get me to answer them, okay? Cool, so let's go to the next slide. All right, background, just to give everybody a little bit of preview. We mostly know this. How do companies disseminate information? They do it internally. Public relations, reports to SEC, all of that stuff. They also do it externally. And who's the big external sources? Sell-side analysts, those that work for big banks. We also have the buy-side analysts, credit rating agencies, newspapers, other people, sort of the indirect people. These indirect people are who we're going to be drawing our information from, okay? Sell-side analyst job description. So they provide their information through the reports, their earnings estimates, and also the recommendations. They can issue an upgrade or a downgrade. And given that they, their job, what they're doing is trying to bring valuable information to investors. So in that respect, they always have to be bringing a proprietary angle, something novel. Nobody wants to trade and buy your research report if you're not bringing a novel idea. And this is something where when we talk about the AI definition we're using, and I'll touch on it more in a minute, it becomes really important because, even if their firms don't internally adopt AI, they clearly have this pressure and this feeling because it's harder and harder for them to get an edge. It's harder for them to find that trading angle because that information may have been incorporated into prices already, or that information came out through an alternative source. And so this is why we think about, in particular, the case of AI, while this is just analysts, lots of people have to forecast demand, lots of people have to forecast sort of different informations, and the quality of a job like an analyst is a little bit more generalizable in that sense. Okay, so in the US, let's think about what do analysts do? They're typically part of a cost center rather than a profit center. They typically cover like 10 stocks, a few industries. I think 2's our average in our sample. They have to clear their recommendation through an internal committee because of conflicts of interest. They still have a fiduciary responsibility to the investing clients, and the compensation is related to abnormal trading volume. Okay, and so that's sort of, and then the final piece is what I was touching on. Value is based on both their accuracy. So this is how you see these institutional investor magazine ratings, but also the other stuff, that access to management, soft information, sort of, you know, their uniqueness of their trading angle. Okay, so consequences of AI. So these were the picture of some of the all-star analysts. They look middle-aged, sort of standard. And then this guy who's looking for a job because he was an analyst that lost his job. Is that true? Maybe, maybe not. So what do we see? This is 2 graphs. The one on the left is any analyst quitting, and the one on the right is highly accurate analyst quitting. So this, the y-axis is the percent that are quitting and leaving the profession. We can know that they're leaving because of the IBIS data tracks analysts from place to place. And this is the percent of stocks in their portfolio. So say they cover 10 stocks, if 50% of them are high AI stocks, so highly covered by social media. And we see this relationship where it's positive and increasing. So the more high AI stocks you have, the more likely you're to quit. Okay, and this is you know, this also includes controls, but it's just your sort of standard bin scatter when we're controlling for sort of workload, experience, reputation, and time. Okay, so let's get into the empirical strategy and talk about our measures and stuff. So this is the platform. It's tip ranks. And what they do is they basically, this is their SMART score, or an example of it. For any stock, you could type it in up here. It'll give you a score from 1 to 10. And then these are the different data sets that they look at. And so we got their data set from, that has sort of their multitude of social media opinion and sort of this blogger opinion type of data. And we use that, the sort of just raw numbers of counts on a given stock in a given time period. Okay, so AI intensity is the quantity of social media data tips ranks processes for a given stock in a quarter. So they're processing it, they are selling this signal to people, they're selling their platform. Any retail investor can also do it. They also sell to hedge funds. They are also part of E-Trade now. If you pop up on your E-Trade, it's on the right hand side of your screen. So they are very so to put it in perspective, sort of what's the relative association? Apple, Facebook, and Tesla disproportionately get media attention. It's 100x that of sort of household names like Starbucks or Coca-Cola. It's 1000x if you go to like lesser known regional names or like pharmas that people have never heard of in some sense. Okay, our sample covers 2010 to 2017, and the social media data being processed over this time by the firm has tripled. Okay. AI intensity matters to analysts. This is what I was saying before, even if they don't pay attention to social media. So in particular, social media produces crowd wisdom. There's multiple papers now. Jida has some stuff. Roni and I have a separate paper that is now forthcoming, where we've shown that sort of crowd wisdom really does work, and it's going to get incorporated information. And because of this, these analysts are going to feel the pressure even if their firm is internally not adopting AI, even though if we talk to many of them, their firm is internally adopting AI. So I'm going to take a second break to look at a question. So what are the implications of your evidence of substitution for brokerage fees, trading volume? Can you draw inference about analyst compensation from exit or other coverage decisions? We could potentially look at that. We haven't looked at it, but we are looking at volume and prices. At the end, I'll talk to that. And this may be semantics, but why do you call it AI rather than social media intensity? Because we want to emphasize the fact that all of these data sets are going and getting processed into a score. And I've been, you know, Robbie, if you have a question about I've really been trying to think hard about what we could do about the score, because it's not necessarily about the rating of the score, but we have a ton of information on sort of the time when they first get these different score changes and how these data sets are getting processed into it. So I think it's a really potentially fruitful, even for a different paper, sort of thing to think about. Other ones, perfect. Okay, I think I saw the questions. If there was more that I didn't see, let me know. Okay, cool, thanks.
So you've got a question from Jess Jeffers and one from Tanya. Do you want to handle all the questions now?
Sure. That's a good break point.
Do you have the Q&A open, or do you want me to read them for you?
Here, I can get the Q&A open. Okay, now I have the Q&A open. Okay, Jess, this might be for later. While I absolutely see the force that AI can displace analysts by crunching data much more quickly, it also seems like we're getting more and more data every month, and someone has to guide the AI programs and decide what to train them on, etc., as well as interpret the stuff that is coming out of the AI algorithms. Does the second force play any role in mitigating the impact on analysts? Is the new job for analysts to be a computer scientist training managing AI? So this word about managing, I think for sure there's all of this survey evidence that's sort of been coming out of what's going to happen when you adopt AI. And actually the number one thing that executives responded was that they're going to hire new managers. And I think of management and coordination as a social skill. And so this is going to be really the complementary hypothesis that we go to, where we think, okay, maybe, you know, you could change your coverage, or you're not going to spend as much time running an Excel file. But because of that, that frees up your time to do other things like meet with management, which may ultimately generate a better product. Or maybe we don't need as many analysts in the sense that like this job can now be done because you have, you know, the multiple models or sort of this different quant skills. And really what you just need is that one person who's really good at sort of getting through the bullshit. Okay. Next question. Could you clarify, are you interested in how analysts' ability to use AI tools affects their career, or the impact from competition to analysts coming from external players, say hedge funds using data and AI? I mean, I think in some sense, what we're trying to do is come up with a proxy for this AI. We're thinking about it as stock specific, but obviously the fact that hedge funds have been doing this for a long time is true, but hedge funds are analyzing the exact same data that we think is serving that this sort of social media intensity or AI intensity that we're calling it. So, I think it's all about there's AI being processed, it's processed faster, it's forcing them, they're losing their edge in some sense, and they're feeling the pressure. And so what do? Like what skills do they go to? How does it change sort of the overall composition of a task for a high-skilled worker? Okay, an anonymous attendee. In the tips ranks data, did you only use the blogger data or included all 8 data, including fundamentals, etc.? So we did not want to use all of the data specifically because we think that they would be correlated with other stuff. So news data in particular, like that's sentiment driven, and we don't want to be capturing sort of, what other people have found. We sort of wanted to concentrate on variation coming from sort of a data set that's really hard to analyze unless you have AI capabilities or unless you have some natural language processing capabilities, which I think is like the news but different, okay? And that sort of brings me to sort of what I think we should talk about now, which is sort of how we're structuring the analysis. So when we do it in 3 levels. So we're looking first at, do analysts quit? So that's sort of the main analyst level stuff, but we also then look at analyst stock level observations. So this is the question sort of about, are they quitting coverage of a particular stock? And then at the stock level, we can look at other things, sort of like the complexity of the questions that they're asking on earnings calls. But so just always think that we're doing it at 3 different levels, and sort of these all give us different pieces of information about how AI may be affecting things. Okay, let's consider the OLS evidence to start with. So OLS, these are just conditional correlations, but if I'm telling you that we're sort of using the social media data and we think, what becomes popular on Twitter, if you can predict it, maybe you make a lot of money in advertising, I don't know. Who knows? But that's the idea, is that it's a little bit random. If it really is random, then the OLS is awesome. It's informative, especially if we're thinking about an overall portfolio that analysts are covering. But I know most economists can come up with some argument as to why there's little nuanced details. So if AI is associated with simple products or persistent demand or something like that, that would say, oh, okay, this is a less complex information environment. We don't need as many analysts. Okay, that would be that negative correlation that we're understating the true effect. On the other hand, which I think the other hand is a little bit harder to come up with, but it's more like, oh, maybe it's some unexpected news event. But again, if they're random and unexpected, then the OLS would be fine. So it has to be unexpected, non-random, and positively associated with sort of analyst preference for coverage. Okay, that would overstate the true effect. All of our conditional correlations, they are suggesting that AI is a substitute for high-skilled work, but we're going to then take it a step further and look and see, in a different IV setting if this may work out. Okay. So it's not the brokerages, Steve, I'm looking at your question now. Sorry for spamming the Q&A. Are the top analysts exiting because their skills are more similar to AI, or are they simply at brokerages that invest the most in AI? So we do employer fixed effects throughout all of our specifications. So I do not think it's coming from the employer. And I do think that most employers have been investing in it. So our IV, we have an IV instrument. Here goes. It's a short newspaper headline. It is essentially click and bait. What happens? The idea, you actually read something in the news. Great, I'm a blogger, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Reddit, whatever I'm doing. I'm entering this information because I saw a headline that made me think of something that I should comment on. And that's generally actually exactly what it happens. So the idea is that headline length is quasi-random. Since advertisement sales for print editions determine headline length editors use, and the identification comes from sort of incremental changes in the social media induced by short headlines. Okay, so for example, this is one of my favorite ones. This is Wells Fargo. You want to know, is it seemingly random headline variation length? So this is Wells Fargo is getting the heat. Wells Fargo fined for sales scam. Okay, then you get all of these other ones. 5,300 Wells Fargo staff fired for bogus accounts. Wells Fargo fined 185 million for unauthorized accounts. Can go all the way down to the bottom. People really have this title. I think this was a Washington Post article. Wells Fargo fired 5,300 workers for improper sales push. The executive in charge is retiring with 125 million. So this is basically going from roughly 30 characters to over 125. All the same news story. Wide variation in headline length. Variation comes from advertisement sales. Advertisement sales are pre-sold, okay? It's an editor's choice. So it seems random, but let's look more, because there is this worry that we said that it's correlated with what analysts' preference are for who to cover. So maybe, maybe they cover the profitable stocks. Maybe they can make more money there. We look. This is dependent variables headline length. We see no really sort of meaningful variation for 7 million plus headlines. An adjusted R-score of a very small amount, and see it's not associated sort of, whereas if you would put in sentiment or something, these things are typically associated with, market to book and profitability and that stuff, okay? Again, headline length. Now this is the news content. This is the argument that like, oh, it's going to be, you're overstating your effect because it's really this, it's driven by these unexpected news events. These are positive and negative earnings surprises. We don't see any discernible difference in headline lengths associated there. This is any key event. So these key events are coming from the Capital IQ key event data set. It's a great data set if you haven't seen it. I didn't know about it until 6 months ago. Pretty awesome. Also non-earnings events. So we can look at things like, is there an M&A announcement? Is there something going on in the legal sphere for them? Are they having a new product announcement? Stuff like that. And we don't see any meaningful difference in headline length. So in this sense, we think, that we're sort of at least close to orthogonal with respect to firm characteristics and sort of news content. So this would suggest that now we maybe really do have this random variation in, social media intensity across the different stocks in an analyst portfolio. All right, new question. Could it be that those who receive more attention on social media are more competitive environments? So analysts, there is more turnover. Right, so this is exactly what I was sort of saying, that it could be more attention. Typically, if you look at who it is more attention, it's Tesla, it's the Facebook, it's exactly that stuff. I don't think it's that it's more, but we do put in industry fixed effects throughout, just so people want to know about the industry structure. So with that, since I see I'm sort of losing a moment on time, let me go into some of the hypotheses and what we find. So analysts quit their jobs, especially high-skilled ones. So this is showing you the IV results. So we see that across the board, there's quitting and high accurate analyst quitting. Our first stage F stat is strong. These results are not that much greater than what our OLS results were. I think it's maybe, I'm not even, I think it's 1.7 maybe times, but I'm getting that confused with the baseline number right now. So, and also in relative, like percentage baseline, how much more are they quitting than before? I think it's about 15%, so it's also not very large. We have our controls in and stuff like that. So one question you might naturally have is, are they quitting more than in the past? So this, we pulled data back to 2004. Remember, our time span is basically looking at the most recent sort of like 6 years. And what we see is that, yes, analysts quitting and leaving, we see an upward trend over time, okay? And that suggests that, you know, there is something different going on more recently. So then we pull a random sample of 25 each year, which roughly gives us about 398 analysts that have quit and left their profession between 2004 and 2016, and we search for them on LinkedIn. And what we find, if you sort of look at these different breakdowns, is that talent is leaving, many stay in research, but some shift to other skills. So it's still true that they were going to buy-side research jobs, asset management jobs. What we'll end up looking, surprisingly not that many went to fintechs, but when we look at it, what we're really going to see is that they start going towards these sort of investor relations roles, consulting, sort of things that necessarily corporate finance, you know, that would be not requiring sort of the, you know, competition with AI. So what roles do they depart for? And over time, we also see this trend. Research drops over time, non-research increases over time. Then this one, which I think is really sort of fascinating, we look at within our samples, so this is only about 400, so it's only half the sample. So we look at if you were a person who quit who had a particularly high AI intensity stock, what happens to you? And they are less likely and significantly less likely to go to a research job and more likely to go to a non-research job, okay? Great. Okay. Given that I have like 5 minutes, I think I'm just gonna sort of go through results and wait and defer questions till later on. Okay.
So we're happy to give you an extra few minutes since you've essentially been using the Q&A time to answer questions along the
Okay,
so
cool.
whichever way you feel is more efficient, happy to.
All right, cool. So I did have one question. Let's see. Is it implicitly assumed that the firms with more social media data are more AI ready in the sense that AI can better predict them using social media? It is an implicit assumption, but it is also an assumption that is grounded in, you know, several published papers that would suggest this. They're not more noise than information. The signal to noise ratio is sort of, yes. So I get where you're coming from, but I would say Gida's stuff at Notre Dame, my stuff, other people, I can't think of her name right now, but she has very good research too on this stuff. Okay, so robustness for these results, they're very robust. I want to say this is sort of, you know, you get those first questions, should we really believe it? I've done different cuts on the sample. So one worry I had in particular was like, look, I know I'm going to quit, so I'm going to sort of gradually like phase back on my portfolio. And so there's only covering 4 stocks right now. And even though the number of stocks you cover and industries you cover is control variables, you know, there's something about that. And then they're disproportionately the high AI stocks. You know, even if I look at the interquartile range, even if I cut out any outliers, people who are only covering 2 stocks sort of seems odd, the results still hold. Same thing if we look at different thresholds for accuracy. So it's not, you know, before when I was defining highly accurate, I said you're in the top 25 percentile. If I've done, you know, 20 or 33, it doesn't really matter. Same thing if I do different definitions of AI intensity. So rather than the way we had been doing it is like, oh, you're a high AI intensity stock if you're in the top 25%. I've just used the raw number, the log of the raw number, and that's fine. I've done sort of other ones too. And then I think the placebo test, so this is sort of gets to our instrument where I basically made sure that AI intensity matched sort of the mean and variance of the true variable, and then I randomly assigned it. And you get a placebo test and basically doesn't even pass the first stage, and the results are not there. Okay, so intensive margin. So I just showed you the extensive margin. They're quitting, they're departing. This is like very shocking because most of the research would suggest, you know, if you go back to technology, that's not happening. So they're less likely, when we go to the intensive margin, they're also less likely to initiate coverage. Okay, this holds in both specifications. I could do it with an analyst fixed effect or switch to a stock fixed effect if that was your preference. I can't do both because obviously it's only one at one point in time. Same thing now with initiating coverage, or sorry, stopping coverage. They're more likely to stop coverage as well. Okay. And then we do this zero first stage test. So the intuition for this test is you want to find a subsample where you think that they're, you know, not going to be compliers. They're not in the first stage. It's just going to be zero. And so what we think about is like the way social media is it has to go viral. But nothing's going to go viral if it's not a person you really know about. So we look at the microcap stocks and we focus on them, and we would assume that they're sort of a zero first stage. And when we do that, we see that again, when you do this test, then you're putting sort of the direct result and it passes this test. So it sort of supports our exclusion restriction assumption. Okay, so in summary, they're going for substituting for high AI. We see it both in career switching and stocks moving coverage. And so this is consistent with a rich literature on other technologies, but there's a nuance in this literature between early adopters and non-adopters. What we're going to say is that it's actually important in this AI context where adoption isn't dictated by, you know, what's going on within the firms, but it's really this external sort of startup competition that may be leading some to experience employee loss. Now we're going to get into the complementary tasks hypothesis. This is sort of the more fun social skills type of stuff, hard versus social skills. So this is builds off of Dave Deming's work and a lot of, you know, very excellent work out there that's been sort of in the education literature and pushing now, I think, more into mainstream labor literature, but focusing on sort of what are social skills. They're coordination, they are ability to manage, they are sort of those skills that are necessary in our jobs. And so when we think about this, we're going to first start just with the basic earnings calls. We can go through the transcripts. So we see more questions being asked by analysts, and we also see an increase in the complexity of questions. We measure complexity by sort of standard NLP measures, which is total word count. We look at then easy to measure versus hard to measure sort of topics. So the easy to measure are words like profits and sales and stuff like that. Hard to measure is, again, brand and engagement and culture and stuff like that. And we see that they're stop asking about the easy to measure stuff. Presumably AI helps with predicting sales. They ask more about these hard to measure factors, sort of the things like, you know, brand and engagement. We then see a shift to, okay, well, it can change, you know, I can ask better questions. I can really focus more efforts. That's a little bit that one. And I can ask about those things that are harder to measure, but you can also do something else, which is you can spend your time actually in meetings with people. You know, that's what we should do. We're just going to become a meeting culture. We sort of see that evidence. We see an increase in the total number of meetings they have, meetings and this data set that we're using. So I looked at both the Bloomberg corporate events data set, and then we have also used this new Capital IQ data set, which has meetings in it. And what we're seeing, so I think this is the first time this data set's being used. I haven't seen it previously used. We see an increase in meetings with management, and in particular with their sort of clients, with the institutional investors. Okay, the meetings with management are higher than the number of meetings with institutional investors in the overall meeting landscape, just so people know. So it's really concentrating on these ones. So analysts' earnings forecasts. So now we're looking at within analyst stock pairings, so this is an important fixed effect here. So I'm following you over time, and then your stock all of a sudden is getting more media attention. And it's important to note here that if you think about it as sort of a chain reaction, you're going to get into a persistent state. You know, there is an absorbing state there. Stocks, once they become high media attention, tend to stay high media attention rather than sort of going from not being there. So I will say that that is true in thinking about it, but what we end up seeing is that they become more accurate, a little bit less biased. It depends on how you define it. So we can do it as a percentage of consensus or a percentage of stock price. Remember, when we were saying about consensus, we're also going to look at consensus if it changes. The bolder forecast. So bolder forecasts are typically thought to be both strategic, but mostly about effort. Why? Because it takes a lot of effort to be both feel confident that your recommendation is cutting edge, but also to create a cutting edge recommendation that goes against the consensus. And so that's bolder would suggest they're making more effort. Okay, so this suggests, you know, yes, we find evidence of complementarity, okay, and soft skills, and AI is associated with improved product quality. Okay, last and final thing I will just talk about, so we see these sort of implications for earnings. So we see that, you know, the market reacts less and there's less excess volume. And so these are both associated with lower pay. And if you think about Michael Webb's job market paper, and he was talking about how maybe AI is going to be this great thing because it compresses us and we'll have less inequality. This would be totally consistent with this if we think of analysts as, you know, relatively, you know, upper 5 percentile of income, and they're going to now be making less money. Okay, so overall, I think it's a, you know, fun topic because it sort of combines these social skills, but with what's going to be happening with technology in the future of work. And we're asking, if AI is a technology that's going to change many industries, what are the implications for incumbent workers traditionally tasked with sort of AI type work? And we look at equity analysts. Why? Because, well, you know, they're predicting stock prices, and that's really well defined, and we have lots of data, and we can look at it, and we can see, and we can learn. And what do we learn? We learn that they are shifting their skills. They're either leaving the profession if they think that they see writing on the wall, or they're shifting their time to other complementary tasks. That is, they are focusing on their social skills and their sort of coordination efforts and their meetings with management and those things that, you know, take time to develop those skills, almost a lifetime of time. And then the limitations, while we think sell-side analysts share characteristics with many high-skilled workers, you know, the patterns we document may not generalize. So with that, I want to turn it over to my discussant, and then I'll take questions afterwards. Great, thank you guys.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Jill. All right, our discussant is Elisabeth Kempf. And Elisabeth, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you. Let me also switch to full screen mode. And yeah, many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this really interesting paper, and to Jill for a very clear presentation that's going to make my job easier. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time summarizing the paper. Let me just recap. The broad question here is, how does artificial intelligence affect sell-side analysts? The authors actually look at a range of outcome variables. So they're interested in how does it affect analysts' decision to quit the industry, which stocks to cover, how they allocate time across different tasks, and ultimately also their forecast accuracy and bias. And before I get to my comments, let me just say that I really enjoyed reading and thinking about the paper. The economic effects of AI are one of the most important topics of our time. And so I think it's great that the authors took on the challenge to take this difficult question to the data. Of course, as always, the most interesting and important questions also tend to be the hardest to answer. And so in my discussion, I will actually start by going through the ideal thought experiment and perhaps some extensions to the framework that they have in mind that could generate a few additional empirical predictions. Then I will push back a little bit on, you know, whether this paper is really about artificial intelligence or whether we're learning about something else that came up also in the Q&A. And then I'll have a few suggestions for additional analysis that I think would be helpful. All right, So in an ideal world, we would like to see an AI technology exogenously introduced, and then we can look at how does it affect sell-side analysts. And as Jill said, that will depend quite a bit on whether AI substitutes or complements most of the existing tasks that analysts do. Now, most of the paper looks at analysts at a relatively homogeneous group. The authors do have some cross-sectional tests on analyst accuracy that don't necessarily come out of this task-based framework, but I do think it would be helpful to actually think about analysts as heterogeneous. And you could imagine there are analysts that have a comparative advantage of soft skills. So as Jill said, some analysts might be really good at creating relationships with management, getting meetings with them, perhaps getting them to talk about things that other analysts don't get them to talk about, or to communicate with institutional investors. And then there are maybe the more quantitative analysts that have a comparative advantage at crunching numbers, coding, analyzing big data. And you could imagine that AI substitutes more of the tasks that the quantitative analysts are really good at. And so I think by trying to separate analysts ex ante along the skill dimension could actually be really interesting and generate a couple of additional tests here. One way to do that, you could look at, for example, the education. Do they have STEM background, non-STEM background, and or work experience? So that's the ideal scenario. Now, of course, in the real world, we have to. The real world is messy, and so when you want to take that question to the data, it starts with how do we actually measure AI, and what is AI actually used for in investment research? The authors make it sound actually a lot more straightforward than it is. It seems based on, for example, a survey that the CFA Institute did in 2019 that investment managers and research firms seem to be using AI for lots of different things. Can range from using AI to more efficiently extract information from earnings releases and filings, to studying management sentiment and conference calls, to analyzing unstructured data like blogs, news reports, social media, satellite images, etc. And of course, here the authors have to take a stand. What kind of AI are they interested in? They are going to be looking. They're going to be mainly focusing on AI that is used to process social media data. So that's just something to keep in mind, because you could imagine that, for example, the first one, most analysts would not be unhappy about having AI, using AI to extract information about from earnings releases and filings. In fact, when you talk to junior analysts, they're a bit annoyed by the fact that quite a bit of their work is repetitive, trying to get numbers from these releases and filings. Analyzing management sentiment and conference calls is different. That kind of cuts closer to where analysts could see their value added. And so what the authors do here, they are going to count the number of social media posts and use that as a proxy for AI intensity. So that's a stock level measure, and they get the number of social media posts from TipRanks. I had never visited the TipRanks website, so after reading this paper, that's what I did, and it's actually very interesting. This is the profile that you would get. Jill also showed it in her presentation. I looked at Amazon. You get the SMART score, which here is 9, so on Amazon, they're pretty bullish. And then that is based on these 8 components. Now, I didn't quite understand whether they're using AI to study all of these different data sets or just the blogger opinions. I think that would be something that would be helpful to clarify in the paper. I think based on what Jill said earlier when answering Q&A, it seems to be that they're using AI everywhere, but they kind of like to focus on the blogger opinions because it's maybe less messy or maybe more AI intensive than these other data sets. So I think that would be helpful. And then if you zoom in on these blogger opinions, then you also get another overview. It tells you that overall the bloggers on Amazon are bullish. And then below, it tells you blogger sentiment is based on 110 blogger opinions. I think that would be the number that the authors are using, and maybe Jill can correct me if I'm wrong. That seems to be the number that they're interested in. Now here in the top, okay, that's right. Okay, great. Now in the top right corner, you also see where these articles come from. 38% of them are from Seeking Alpha, 28% from Investor Place, 21% of Full.com. Here below, you see, who these people are, Josh Enomoto and from Investor Place and so forth. So I think that is something that surprised me. The first thing that I had in mind is, when we're talking about the social media posts, Twitter or LinkedIn, etc., that does not seem to be a lot of what they talk about here in terms of blog posts. It seems to be these independent investment research websites that also provide opinions on stocks. So that leads me to the second point. Is this paper about artificial intelligence, or could I also think about it as the effect of blogger competition on sell-side analysts? Which is also an interesting question, but not necessarily, it doesn't have to do anything with artificial intelligence. Now, again, the argument that the authors are making is that when there's more blog posts, AI has more to work with. So, if the more data you throw at them, the more AI intensive it's going to be. But you could also imagine that, well, there's another effect, a direct effect of competition, that now you also have Josh, Ian, Will, and Neil, issue information about about Amazon in addition to the sell-side analysts. So then I was thinking about, are there some empirical predictions that would separate the blogger competition story from the AI story? And it turns out that you would get very much the same prediction. So more blogger competition should predict higher departure rates, more of a coverage shift towards low competition stocks, more time spent on management meetings, higher accuracy, lower bias. And by the way, the more time spent on management meetings would also make sense here, because that's where the advantage of the sell-side analyst lies relative to Investor Place and Seeking Alpha. And you would expect also muted market reaction to new recommendations. So I feel like just based on the empirical predictions, it's really hard to tell these two stories apart. Does the IV help here? So the instrument, as Jill explained, is an indicator for short headline length. And I think the authors have done a really good job at convincing us that headline length does not seem to be correlated with firm characteristics, and mostly also not with event characteristics. So it's as good as randomly assigned. But I think the question here still remains is, does headline length affect outcomes only via AI intensity, or also via, attention from just the fact that you again have more bloggers posting and so more competition for sell-side analysts. And again, the idea here behind the instrument is work by Tarek Omar that shows that short titles attract more attention. So bloggers post more in response to short titles. That could feed more information to the AI, but it could also mean more direct competition for sell-side research. All right. So, what could be alternative approaches to get around that issue? I don't know whether your data allows you to look back and see when TipRanks actually starts to cover a certain stock, or other AI platforms start to cover a stock. That could be used for variation. Or maybe you can get a variation in AI adoption across financial institutions. So for example, HSBC launched its first equity index powered by AI in May 2020. And so maybe, when you see these banks adopting, offering these AI products, you can assume that they also have this technology in-house that's also used by equity research. And I think an advantage of that would be that you could have variation across brokerage firms for the same stock. All right, then in terms of additional analysis, I actually really liked the part of the analysis where you look at where these analysts go. I think it was really interesting that you're showing that they're less likely to go to these to the traditional research jobs So right now, the authors do that for a random sample of 25 analysts per year. I think if you can enlarge that sample, you could even show a finer breakdown of future jobs. I thought in particular, investor relations is like one of the jobs where if you think about the social skill component, I would imagine that is higher, requires more social skills even relative to the equity research job. So I think you could even, drill down further into the types of jobs that these analysts are going to if you expand that. And I really like that part of the analysis. Another thing that I think would be interesting to look at is how their research output changes. In their reports, do they start to provide different kinds of information? Do they become longer? Do they discuss more qualitative topics, like you mentioned, brand, etc., culture? So do they change their output in addition to the earnings forecast that you've already looked at? So I have a bunch of smaller comments. In the interest of time, I'll skip those. I think they're more interesting for the authors than perhaps for the audience. So to wrap up, I thought it was a really thought-provoking paper on one of the most important topics of our time. My main suggestions for improvement would be to perhaps, get a couple of additional empirical predictions out of this framework that you're using. Be a bit more transparent on the measure of AI intensity, what exactly goes in there, and maybe think about the framing of the paper. Is there any way you can rule out this competition channel from the AI channel? So thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you so very, very much. Jill, do you want to take a moment or two to respond? Or
Sure. Thanks, Elisabeth. I thought they were great comments. And I think that, yes, the competition channel. So investor relations, interestingly, is the only one that comes up as significant if I were to break out individual titles of roles. I think that just is really our sample size. But also, I know my RA spent like a week on just getting the sample that big. So I didn't want to put his task in doing that much more. All right. But thanks for the great comments. I really appreciate it.
other questions that were not addressed or that members of the audience would like to offer up?
Feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute you as well.
I see one. Love the research. Is there any way to see what tasks the increased meetings are actually substituting? In other words, which tasks experience a decrease in time spent doing by the analysts? No, I wouldn't necessarily know what they do. In addition, why would we expect AI to lower analyst questions about easier to measure concepts such as sales? I mean, I think that one's pretty straightforward, that you would think that what the AI is best at, or it has been predicting sales in the short term. I think there's a lot of evidence of sort of real-time predictions. What we're good at for AI is, that's why we can know the weather 6 hours ahead, but we can't know the weather 24 hours ahead. Those types of things. Other questions? Why do we need to argue that AI adoption does not rely on internal investments by incumbents, but on external startup innovations? It is most certainly true that incumbents help to build their AI capabilities by buying AI startups. Yeah, so I really like, I think our paper complements a lot of the work by Tanya and Anastasia and Alex and James, but what I think their paper is showing is sort of this concentration by incumbents, and I think that this is just sort of unique in the sense of, if we think about electricity and all of that stuff, it was not startups, it was a lot of this like big firm investment. And so here it's, where's the competition coming from? And I don't mind it being framed as a competition story. I actually think that that's exactly what it is. Technology in some sense is competing with jobs, whereas before it had always only been competing with low skill jobs, not high skill jobs. And so in that sense, I think having investment on both fronts, but it makes a difference for the maneuvering that you would do. If you were a firm, or if you were a person in that job, what are you going to do? Are you going to go out and work for a startup? probably, and this is sort of, there's also a really nice paper I like about the returns to investment, that basically it's only the AI producing firms, not the AI adopting firms, that are basically extracting rents. I think it leads to what I would encourage anybody to do more research on, is sort of this open trajectory about the strategic use of AI and sort of how that's playing out in mix with the financial considerations of firms. But anyways, thanks so much for your questions. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the organizers. I think it's a great series, and you guys always do an awesome job of curating the program and stuff. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Elisabeth. Just a reminder, I put in the chat, we have the lecture series, our monthly lecture series on topics in entrepreneurial finance and innovation. Next Monday, Arthur Cordaway is presenting a lecture on the risk and return of private equity. He's an expert in that area. He's got actually a handbook chapter on it. So I encourage everyone to sign up. It will also be recorded if you can't make it. The sign up link is in the chat window, so feel free. Otherwise, we will see you guys either next week or the following week. What do we have? I think, what is the 5th? I should know this. I'm poorly prepared for this. What do we have for next? Adair Morse is going to be presenting some work on COVID and small business survival in Oakland. Really cool paper on the effects in Oakland. So thanks again for coming. We'll see you all, everyone, either next week or the following week.